The leather was splitting right down the center of the saddle skirt, and if Clara Whitmore had to listen to one more rancher tell her a woman had no business doing the work, she was going to use her all for something far less constructive than stitching. It was the summer of 1874, deep in the sun-scorched heart of Montana Territory, where the Yellowstone River carved its ancient path through sage and stone, and the town of Harlow's Crossing sat at the edge of the wilderness, like a man who couldn't decide whether to stay civilized or go feral. The settlement was small but stubborn. A general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a church that doubled as a courthouse on days when Judge Aldrich rode through, and a leather and tack shop that had belonged to Clara's father before his heart gave out in the spring. Clara sat on the broad wooden bench outside that shop now, her dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to curl against her jaw the way they always did when the heat pressed down. She was 24 years old, with calloused hands that told the story of a life spent working and a spine straight enough to rival the fence posts she'd driven herself into the frozen ground last February. The saddle draped across her bench belonged to Sheriff Holt, who needed it back by sundown, which meant she had roughly 4 hours to repair stitching that had been improperly done the first time by the previous tradesman and had been pulling apart a thread at a time ever since. She had her awl in her right hand and a heavy-duty harness needle threaded with waxed linen cord in the other, and she was making good progress when the sound of hooves on the dirt road drew her attention up from the leather. He came in from the North Road. That much was immediately clear, because the North Road led out of the mountains, out of the high country where the elk ran and the grizzlies still held dominion over whole valleys, and the man on that horse looked like he belonged to that world far more than he would ever belong to Harlow's Crossing. He rode a dun mare, big and capable, the kind of animal bred for endurance rather than elegance. The man himself was enormous, not just tall, though he was certainly that, but built in the way that the mountains themselves were built, with a kind of density and permanence that the eye recognized as immovable. His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway with room to spare, and beneath the worn buckskin shirt he wore, the musculature of his arms and chest was the kind that came not from vanity, but from years of actual labor, of hauling timber and stretching hides and working against the resistance of the wilderness itself. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, wind-tangled from the ride, and his jaw carried several days of beard that matched it. He wore a battered hat tilted back enough that she could see his face, weathered, yes, tanned to bronze by sun and altitude, but with features that were arresting in their directness, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once, and eyes that, when they found her, were the color of a river in shadow. Clara looked back down at her saddle. She was not a woman who stared. She heard him slow his horse near the hitching post in front of the livery 2 doors down, heard him dismount with the particular ease of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off it, and she assumed that was the end of it. Stranger rides through, stranger moves on. That was the ordinary rhythm of this place, but the footsteps came her way. She kept her eyes on her work. The awl found the next hole in the leather, and she pushed the needle through with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been watching this craft since before she could properly hold the tools. Her father had started teaching her when she was 6 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the bench, and the motions were as natural to her as breathing now. The footsteps stopped. "That split's going clear through to the tree," a voice said, low and unhurried, like the sound of water moving deep in a canyon. "You'll want to reinforce the panel before you stitch, or it'll pull again within a season." Clara paused her work. She did not look up immediately, because she had learned long ago that men like to believe they've surprised a woman into paying attention. She finished the stitch she was on, pulled the cord snug with measured pressure, and then she raised her eyes. He was standing at a respectful distance, not crowding the bench, one hand resting loose at his side and the other holding his hat by the brim. Up close, he was even larger than he'd appeared on horseback, which was saying something. His eyes were darker than she'd thought from a distance, not quite gray, not quite green, something that shifted the way river water shifted depending on the sky above it. "I'm aware of that," she said pleasantly enough. "I've already cut a backing panel from the shoulder I pulled this morning. It's soaking in the water bucket there so it'll shape to the curve." He glanced at the bucket beside the bench where a strip of heavy leather sat submerged, and then looked back at her with something that might have been respect if she'd been reading it right. "You've done this before," he said. "My father owned this shop for 30 years, she said. "And before anyone asks, no, there isn't a man coming to take over. My father is buried on the hillside east of town, and I intend to run this shop for 30 years of my own." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "I wasn't going to ask," he said. She regarded him for a moment, this mountain of a man standing in the dust of her street with his hat in his hand, and what appeared to be the honest truth in his expression. "What brings you down from the high country?" He glanced back toward the livery. "Horse threw a shoe on the pass. Figured I'd come in, get her reshod, resupply, and be back up before the week's out." He paused. "Elias Cade. Clara Whitmore." She didn't offer her hand because she was in the middle of work, and they both seemed to understand that as the perfectly reasonable situation it was. "Tom Henley does the farrier work. He'll be at the livery until 4. Elias Cade nodded but didn't move. His eyes had dropped back to the saddle, and she could see him looking at the repair with the kind of attention that wasn't idle. It was the attention of someone who actually knew what he was looking at. "I can do that for you," he said, "if you've got the tools." Clara looked at him steadily. "I have the tools. I also have the skill and the time. But thank you." There was a pause. In her experience, that was the moment most men used to push harder or to leave in a huff. Elias Cade did neither. He looked at the repair again, looked at her hands still holding the awl and needle, and then, without asking permission or offering any particular explanation, he stepped back toward the wall of the shop and leaned against it in a way that communicated, with remarkable economy of movement, that he was staying to watch. Clara blinked once. Then she returned her attention to the saddle. It was the strangest thing. She had expected to feel watched, in the uncomfortable way one felt watched when a man was trying to find something to criticize. But as the minutes passed and she worked her way along the stitching line, reinforcing the split, working in the backing panel with the careful hand pressure that kept the layers aligned, she realized that what she felt coming from the man leaning against her wall was not critique. It was attention of a different kind, the kind that paid respect. She pulled a stitch tight and glanced sideways at him. He was watching her hands. "You do saddle work yourself," she said. It was not a question. "When there's no other option," he said, "which in the mountains is most of the time. But I've never had the formal training for it." He nodded toward the backing panel she was working in. "My father would have just stitched over the split and called it done." "And it would have opened again in a year," she said. "It did open again in a year," he confirmed, and there was a dry quality to his voice that she found she liked. "Where did you come from, Mr. Cade?" "Originally." "Virginia," he said. "Long time ago." "What brought you west?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that men from the mountains sometimes were, not rudely, but thoughtfully, as though they'd spent so much time with only their own thoughts for company that they'd lost the habit of answering quickly. "The war ended, and the world I'd known before it was gone," he said finally. "The mountains seemed like a place where a man could find something honest." Clara stopped stitching for just a moment, a fraction of a beat before her hands resumed their rhythm. She understood that more than she could have explained to him right then. The war had taken her brother Thomas, who'd been 19 when he went east and hadn't come back. It had left a hole in their family that had never quite closed, and she thought sometimes that grief was its own kind of wilderness. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Honesty up there?" He looked out toward the mountains, the peaks still carrying snow at their crowns even in July, white against the brutal blue of the Montana sky. "I found something," he said. "Something closer to quiet than I had before. Whether that's the same thing, I couldn't tell you." She considered that answer for a while, working in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun climbed toward its highest point, and the dust in the street turned gold in the light. A wagon rolled by, and Mrs. Halverson from the general store raised her eyebrows almost imperceptibly in Clara's direction, telegraphing with the universal efficiency of small-town women the question of who the large stranger was. Clara gave her the smallest shake of her head that communicated she had no useful information to offer. After a while, Elias said, "You've been running this shop alone since spring?" "Since March," she said. "The town doesn't help?" "The town is generally kind," she said carefully, "but there is a distinction between kindness and respect, and the kindness sometimes comes wrapped in suggestions that I sell the shop to someone better equipped to run it." "Better equipped meaning a man?" "That is the implication, yes." She pulled the last of the backing panel stitches tight and inspected her work with a critical eye. The bond was clean and even, the leather flat and firm. She felt the satisfaction of it settle in her chest the way good work always did. Elias had crossed his arms over his chest, and in her peripheral vision she could see the way the motion shifted the breadth of his shoulders, the flex and settle of muscle under the buckskin. "Looks to me like the person best equipped to run it is already running it," he said. Clara looked up at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without that particular quality that some men had of needing to look away when a woman looked directly at them, as if direct attention from a woman was a thing to be deflected. He just looked back, steady and unhurried. "Thank you," she said. It came out more softly than she'd intended. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off from the wall. "I should get my horse seen to before Henley closes up." He settled his hat back on his head, and the shadow of the brim fell across his face in a way that made him look even more like something that had walked out of the landscape rather than into the town. "Good work on that saddle, Miss Whitmore." She watched him walk away toward the livery, and she was somewhat irritated to note that she kept watching him for longer than was strictly necessary. She returned to the saddle. There was still the final layer of finishing to do, the edges to seal, the whole surface to treat with oil so the leather would stay supple through the next few seasons of use. She worked steadily, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a small and persistent corner of her attention kept noting that the man had gone into the livery and had not yet come back out. Tom Henley, she knew, was a talker. If a stranger came in with an interesting story, and clearly Elias Cade was a man with interesting stories, Tom would bend his ear for an hour before he picked up a nail. The afternoon moved. She finished the saddle, carried it inside, hung it on the appropriate hook in the back room where Sheriff Holt could collect it, and began sorting through the other work waiting. A pair of bridles that needed new cheek pieces, a set of harness traces that had been dropped off by the Langley family from the farm east of town, and the slow, careful work of cutting new soles for a pair of boots that old Reverend Clark had been wearing since before the war and was frankly sentimental about. She was so deep in the work that she didn't hear the door open until Elias Cade was already inside. He stopped when he saw her head come up, holding up one hand in a gesture of peaceable intent. "Your door was open," he said. "The door is always open when I'm working," she said. "What can I do for you?" He held up a pair of leather gauntlets, trail-worn and cracked at the cuff seams. "Henley said you'd do stitching work. These are coming apart." Clara took them from him, turned them in her hands, examining the damage. The leather itself was good quality, or had been once. Someone had cared for these. The cracking at the seams was from hard use and cold. The stitching had simply given out under the repeated stress of work. She could see the indentations in the leather where his hands had shaped it over years of wear, the thumbs worn smooth in the spot where a rope was habitually gripped. She looked up at him. "These have some years on them." 12, he said. "I know that's old for a working glove." "It's not the leather I'd worry about. The leather's been well kept, it's the thread." She turned to her supply shelf. "I can have them done by morning if you're not leaving before then." "Henley can't get the shoe on until tomorrow morning anyway," Elias said. "The nail he needs is apparently not the nail he has on hand." "That sounds like Tom," she said. "He's a good farrier and a terrible inventory man." A sound came from Elias that was almost a laugh, not quite, not full, but something warm that lived in the same neighborhood. She found herself pleased to have produced it. She set the gauntlets on her secondary bench and began threading a curved needle with the heavy waxed thread appropriate for the job. "Is there anywhere you're staying tonight?" "Widow Pierce lets out a room," he said. "Henley mentioned it." "She's good people," Clara said. "Her cooking will hold you until morning." He seemed to make a decision then, because instead of heading back for the door, he pulled out the low stool that sat near the secondary bench, a stool that various customers had used over the years while discussing orders, and sat on it. The stool was sized for ordinary men and looked slightly absurd under him, but he seemed entirely unbothered by this. "You don't mind?" he asked after he'd already sat. "No," she said, and discovered that was honest. She worked on the gauntlets and they talked. Not about anything of particular consequence at first. The condition of the North Road, the way the weather in the high country had been running cold and wet into late spring, the trouble with pack mules that thought they knew better than their handlers. But the conversation had a quality to it that Clara hadn't experienced in a long time, a certain ease, a back and forth that didn't require her to manage anything or perform anything. He wasn't trying to impress her, and she wasn't trying to manage his ego, and the result was a conversation that felt like breathing, natural and necessary and quietly sustaining. She learned that he had a cabin at about 7,000 feet elevation, 2 days' ride north and west. He had come up from Virginia after Appomattox, spent a few years working as a scout for the Army, found the work morally complex in ways he didn't elaborate on, but that she could read between the lines of, and had eventually retreated to the high country where he trapped and hunted and occasionally worked as a guide for the survey crews that were still mapping the territory. He grew what he could in the short mountain growing season, traded furs for what he couldn't grow, and had managed to make a life that suited him, or so he said, with the slight undertone of a man who wasn't sure that solitude was entirely what he'd wanted when he'd sought it. Clara told him about her father, about learning the trade, about the way the shop had been a two-person operation until it wasn't anymore, and about how she'd simply scaled herself up to fill the space. She told him about the ranchers who brought their work to her, because she was cheaper than ordering from Miles City, and then tried to pay her less than the quoted price on the grounds that she should be grateful for the business. She told him this with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by this behavior and had simply developed efficient strategies for dealing with it, all of which involved holding firm on her prices and watching men decide that being charged fairly was preferable to riding 40 miles to the next leather shop. He listened to all of it in the way that was becoming, she thought, characteristic of him, completely, without preparing his next contribution while she was still talking. By the time she'd finished the gauntlets, the light outside had gone golden and long, the way Montana summer evenings did when the sun dropped toward the mountains and the whole world turned the color of honey. She held up the gloves, inspected the stitching, flexed the cuffs to check the tension, and placed them on the bench. "Done," she said. He picked them up, ran his thumb along the stitching the same way she had, and there was something about the gesture that she found unexpectedly moving, the care of it, the recognition that this was the right way to test the work. "Perfect," he said. He reached into his coat for his billfold. 30 cents, she said. He paid without argument. She liked that about him, too. He stood, which restored the natural order of the universe in terms of scale. When he was on that too-small stool, she'd managed to almost forget how big he was. But standing, he filled the shop in a way that was not threatening, just substantial, the way a good tree filled a clearing. "I'll collect them in the morning if that's all right," he said, setting them back on her bench. "I'll be here by 6, she said. He nodded, turned toward the door, and then paused with his hand on the frame. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not turning around. "Mr. Cade. Thank you for the conversation." She considered this for a moment, the strangeness and the rightness of it. "Thank you for yours," she said. The door swung behind him, and she stood in the evening shop with the smell of leather and oil and wax around her, and the feeling that something had shifted, quietly and without ceremony, the way the light shifted at this hour, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but in a way that changed the quality of everything. She closed up the shop, walked the half-block to the small house she occupied behind it, cooked her supper, and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who had sat on a too-small stool in her shop and asked nothing of her except the pleasure of her company, and who had paid her fairly for her work and called it perfect. She thought about eyes the color of river shadow and a voice like deep water moving, and she told herself firmly that he was a mountain man with a cabin at 7,000 feet and a horse that needed re-showing, and that she was a woman with a business and a reputation to maintain, and that none of what she was currently thinking was productive. Then she thought about him for another hour anyway. She was up before first light, as was her habit. She lit the stove, made coffee, dressed in her working clothes, A dark skirt heavy enough to stand up to the rough edges of her work, a practical blouse, an apron of thick canvas that had been her father's and that she'd cut down to fit her. She carried her coffee across to the shop, unlocked it, set up for the morning's work. He arrived at 6 o'clock precisely, which she found she was not surprised by. He was wearing a clean shirt, still buckskin, but a different one, and he'd trimmed the beard slightly, not removed it, just neatened it, and his dark hair was damp at the edges, as if from washing. He looked, if anything, even more striking in the clear morning light than he had the previous afternoon, the mountain landscape of him even more pronounced against the gray blue of the early sky behind him. He came in, saw that she was already working, and said, "Good morning." "Coffee?" she said, because her mother had raised her right and the pot was full. He looked briefly surprised, as though this had not been an offer he'd expected, and then he sat back down on his stool and accepted the tin cup she handed him with both hands, wrapped around it in a way that made the cup look small. "The saddle was for the sheriff?" he asked. "He collected it last evening on his way to the Dusty Spur," she said. "He looked at the repair for about 30 seconds and asked how much." "And you told him?" $2, she said. Which was fair, and he knew it because he stood there for a moment like he was thinking about arguing, and then he paid it. The corner of Elias's mouth moved. Good. They sat in the morning quiet with their coffee, and it was entirely comfortable in a way that Clara could not account for and was not sure she wanted to examine too closely. The town was waking up around them. She could hear the Halverson boy carrying milk cans across the street, the sound of someone working a pump, a dog announcing its opinions about the morning with great enthusiasm. "Tom should have the shoe on by 8, Elias said. "I know." A pause. "There's no reason I'd need to leave before noon if the resupply takes time," he said. "The general store opens at 7, she said, very carefully, not looking at him. Another pause, this one with a different quality. "I could pick up anything you need," he said, "if your work keeps you here." She set her coffee cup down and looked at him directly, because she was not a woman who pretended things were other than what they were. He met her look with the same steadiness she'd noticed the day before. There was something in his face that was open in a way that she wouldn't have expected from a man so built for self-sufficiency. Something that was, she thought, a little uncertain. Not about what he was saying, but about how it would be received. She realized that this man, who could fell a tree and field dress an elk and survive alone at 7,000 feet through a Montana winter, was uncertain about whether she wanted his company. "I don't need anything from the general store," she said, "but you're welcome to stay and have breakfast at the hotel if you're not in a hurry. Mrs. Dawes does good eggs." The smile arrived properly this time, not just a corner of his mouth but the whole thing, and it changed his face in a way that was fairly catastrophic for Clara's resolve to maintain a reasonable and measured perspective on the situation. He had good teeth, which was not a given out here, and the smile reached his eyes, and his eyes were river shadow green-gray and very warm. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. They had breakfast at the Harlow's Crossing Hotel dining room, which was really just Mrs. Dawes's kitchen table with 4 additional tables pushed into her front parlor, and which served as the social center of the town in the mornings before the saloon took over in the evenings. Several people noted their arrival with interest. Clara was known to eat breakfast alone with her newspaper when she ate there at all, and Elias Cade was a stranger, and small towns ran on curiosity. She introduced him as a customer, which was accurate if incomplete. He was polite to everyone who spoke to him with the economical courtesy of a man who liked people well enough in small doses and knew how to be sociable without being social. Mrs. Halverson came in for her morning tea and gave Clara a look of such pointed inquiry over Elias's shoulder that Clara had to focus very hard on her eggs. After breakfast they walked back toward the shop, and it was so natural that she didn't notice until they were halfway there that they were walking side by side, his stride shortened to match hers, and that she was telling him about the trouble she'd been having sourcing a particular grade of harness leather since the merchant she'd used in St. Louis had retired, and he was listening with the kind of attention that was becoming familiar to her now. "There's a tannery in Bozeman," he said. "Family named Kowalski. Good quality, fair price. I traded them a winter's worth of elk hide last year. I could give you a letter of introduction if you wanted to write to them." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "I can supply you with paper and pen. They went into the shop, and she set him up at the corner of her big bench with a piece of letter paper and a pen, and she returned to the harness traces while he wrote. He wrote in a large, clear hand that surprised her. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, something rougher perhaps, but the writing was confident and well-formed. He'd had schooling somewhere in his history. When he finished, he blotted the paper and handed it to her. The letter was direct and warm, explaining who she was and what she needed, and recommending her work based on observation of one afternoon, which she found touched her more than it had any right to. "One afternoon," she said, reading it. "A skilled craftsperson can be evaluated in one afternoon," he said. "You were thorough on that repair in ways that a worse tradesperson would not have bothered with. Anyone who knows the work will recognize that." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept her business correspondence. "You know leatherwork. I've had to learn enough to survive with it," he said. "But there's a difference between functional and skilled. Yours is skilled." She felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the July morning. She turned back to the harness traces before he could see it in her face. He did help her eventually, though she hadn't asked and wouldn't have. The harness traces were a two-person job if done properly, one person to hold the tension and one to stitch. And after watching her compensate for the lack of a second pair of hands for about 15 minutes, he stood up from his stool and simply positioned himself at the other end of the bench and held the tension without comment. She didn't tell him he didn't need to. She handed him the trace, positioned his hands where she needed them, and they worked together in a rhythm that arrived after a few minutes of adjustment with a naturalness that was a little unnerving. He was not overconfident about the work. He didn't try to take over or suggest better approaches. He did what she needed him to do and paid attention. And once, when she told him to increase the tension slightly, he adjusted with exactly the right degree of correction. She thought he would have been a good apprentice to her father, and then thought that was a strange and private thing to think, and then thought it again anyway. Tom Henley appeared at noon with the news that the dun mare was reshod and in good health and ready to travel whenever Mr. Cade chose to collect her. Tom delivered this news with elaborate casualness while his eyes traveled between Elias and Clara with the cheerful nosiness of a man who had entirely too much time to observe other people's business. "Thank you, Tom," Clara said, with a look that communicated in full the limits of his welcome in this particular moment. Tom left, whistling. Elias looked at his hat, which was sitting on the corner of the bench. He looked at the door. He looked at Clara. "I need to go to the general store," he said, "for my resupply." "I know," she said, "and then I suppose I should be heading back up before the afternoon gets too old." "It's a long ride," she agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and there was something careful in his voice, the same uncertainty she'd noted that morning. This man who was afraid of nothing the wilderness could offer him was careful with this. "I come down to the settlement every few months, when I need supplies or when there's repair work." "I imagine you'll have repair work," she said. "You work hard on your equipment." "I do," he said. "And I imagine some of it will need attention beyond what I can manage myself." "I expect it will," she said. He picked up his hat. "Then I imagine I'll be back in September or October at the latest." She met his eyes. "I'll be here," she said. He put his hat on and walked to the door, and she watched him go with a feeling she refused entirely to call loss. It was not loss. He was simply a customer who would return in 2 months, which was completely ordinary, and she had work to do, and she was a sensible woman. She returned to her harness traces and stitched for 20 minutes before she realized she'd done the last 4 inches at the wrong tension and had to pull it out and start over. The weeks passed in the way that Montana summer weeks did, with an abundance of daylight and work that expanded to fill it. Clara finished the harness traces, resolved the boot situation for Reverend Clark to his satisfied and teary gratitude, took on 3 new saddle orders from ranchers who'd heard about the repair she'd done on Sheriff Holt's equipment, and began the methodical process of writing to the tannery in Bozeman with Elias Cade's letter of introduction attached. August brought heat that sat on the valley like a physical weight, the kind of heat that turned the distant mountains into a shimmering watercolor and made everyone in the settlement move a little slower and speak a little shorter. Clara rigged a canvas awning over the outside bench so she could work in the open air without being cooked, and she developed the habit of bringing out a second tin cup of water whenever she made her own, because the heat was the kind that snuck up on you, and she'd once watched her father faint dead away on a July afternoon and had never forgotten it. She thought about Elias Cade in the way that a person thinks about a problem they haven't solved, not obsessively, not with the frantic quality of infatuation, but persistently, with a low background awareness that would surface when she least expected it. She'd be in the middle of cutting a bridle and suddenly be thinking about the way he'd held the tension on the harness trace, the exact firmness of his grip that had told her he understood what he was holding. She'd be eating her supper in the quiet of her small house and find herself wondering what supper looked like at 7,000 feet, whether he cooked over an open fire or had a proper stove, what the view from his cabin door looked like in the evening. She wrote it all off as perfectly normal curiosity about an interesting person and managed to mostly believe herself. The response from the Kowalski Tannery in Bozeman arrived in late August, enthusiastic and detailed, offering terms that were considerably better than anything she'd been able to arrange since her father's St. Louis contact had retired. She wrote back immediately with a proper order, and when she filed the correspondence, she stood for a moment with the folder in her hands, thinking about the chain of events that had led to this. A horse with a missing shoe, a man who'd ridden in from the North Road, and the particular quality of attention he'd paid to her work. September arrived with the first cold in the mornings, the kind that reminded you winter was a real and inevitable thing up here in the high country, not a theoretical season, but a fact that required preparation. Clara began taking on the storage work that ranchers brought in every fall, saddles and harness sets that wouldn't be used through the winter and were better kept in the dry and organized conditions of the shop than in most farmhouse barns. She oiled and conditioned and inventoried and stacked, and the shop smelled even more richly of leather and lanolin than usual, and she found she loved it all, the working and the smell and the purpose of it. She was sorting through a particularly complicated set of driving harness one afternoon when she heard hooves on the North Road. She set down the harness immediately. She picked it right back up again, because she was not a woman who abandoned her work for uncertain possibilities, and she continued sorting with her eyes on the straps in her hands. The hooves slowed. She did not look up. "You reinforced the panel all the way around," Elias Cade said from the doorway of her shop. "Not just the section that was split. You can see it from the exterior stitching pattern." She looked up. He was standing in her doorway, filling it the way she remembered. All of him, the breadth of shoulders, the long dark hair under his hat, the weathered face that was so direct and so alive in a way she hadn't let herself fully remember from a distance. He was carrying his saddlebags over one shoulder and his rifle in the other hand, which meant he'd come straight to her from the livery, or possibly hadn't even stopped at the livery yet. "You're early," she said. "You said September or October?" "I said September at the latest," he said. "It's September. It's the 3rd of September. The month had to start somewhere." He stepped inside, set his rifle carefully against the wall in the corner the way she'd noticed he always put it, out of the way but within reach, and set his saddlebags on the floor. He looked at the harness in her hands. "Is that the Langley outfit?" "The Whitmore shop's business is not typically a topic of wide conversation," she said. "Tom Henley asked me this morning if I was coming straight here, and when I said yes, he said to tell you the Langley driving harness had better be done before the first frost, or he'd never hear the end of it." He seemed to find this entire interaction entertaining. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Tom Henley was going to be the death of her dignity. "The Langley harness will be done by Friday," she said, "and I'll thank you not to share my scheduling with the entire territory." "Tom asked me," he said, "not the territory." She set the harness down on the bench and looked at him properly, and something in her chest did a thing she chose not to name. He looked well. He looked the same as she remembered, and somehow more so, the way someone looks when you've been carrying an imperfect mental image of them and the reality corrects it. His face had a quality of almost smiling that she suspected was his default state of existence, contained, not performing it, just carrying it somewhere just below the surface. "Are you well?" she asked. "I am," he said. "You?" "Busy," she said, "which is good." He came to the bench, not to the stool this time, but to stand beside her, and looked at the driving harness with an assessing eye. What's the trouble with this one? Two of the traces are worn to the point of replacement, not repair, she said. I'm trying to determine whether to replace them in kind with what I have in stock or to order better material and make Mr. Langley wait. What's in stock? Good quality but not great, she said. The new leather I ordered through your Bozeman contact would be a considerable improvement. He picked up one of the worn traces, examined the grain, compared it to a strip of new leather she had lying on the bench. How long to get the Bozeman material? 3 weeks. How much does Langley use this rig? Daily, she said. He's a working farmer, not a showman. Then replace with what you have and order the better material for the spring work. He set the trace down. No farmer can wait 3 weeks on his working harness in September. It was the sensible assessment, which was also the one she'd arrived at, but there was something satisfying about the fact that they had arrived there by the same logic. She began setting up for the replacement work without comment, and he pulled his stool out, she'd come to think of it without meaning to, as his stool, and sat down. How was the summer? She asked. Well, long and productive, he said. Good for a year. The elk were plentiful. I extended the cabin's south wall and got the roof resealed before the weather turned. He paused. I thought about coming down in August, but there was too much to finish before the cold set in. There was no reason to come down in August, she said, very carefully. No, he agreed with the same carefulness, and they both looked at the harness. Then he said, I thought about this place, though, about coming back to it. Clara's hands were very steady on the leather because she was a professional and a composed person. September came around quick enough, she said. It did, he said. Eventually. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at his hands. Mr. Cade, she said. Elias, he said. She had been calling him Mr. Cade in her head all summer because it was proper and because the distance in it was useful. Elias, she said, and his name in her mouth was a different thing than it had been in her mind, warmer, more real. Did you come in for supply work or repair work this time? He reached into his saddlebag and produced a length of cinch strap that had a clean break right through the middle, clearly recent. Cinch broke on the pass, he said. I had a spare, but it's not a good spare. She took it from him, examined the break. Clean break at a stress point, the leather had aged through. I can cut you a new one, she said. Proper length? 28 inches, he said. She went to her leather stock and began selecting the appropriate material, aware of him watching in that attentive way. And she thought about the fact that he'd ridden 4 hours down a mountain pass with a broken cinch to bring it to her shop, specifically when he could have done a serviceable repair himself. And she thought about the word eventually, and she thought, with a kind of helpless acceptance, that she was in considerable trouble. She cut the cinch strap and punched the holes and finished the edges while they talked about the fall work ahead on both their parts, about the news she'd had from the territory. There'd been a land dispute on the South Range that had gotten ugly, 2 brothers fighting over their father's property, and Sheriff Holt had spent 3 weeks mediating before finally threatening to jail both of them, about the survey crew that had come through in August and the maps they were making of the mountain passes. Elias's voice was careful when he talked about the survey work. She could hear the thing under it. The maps bother you, she said. He looked at her. Is it that obvious? To someone paying attention, she said. The survey comes before the railroad. The railroad brings the settlers bring the fences change what the land is. She paused, and also what it was already to the people who were here before any of us. He was quiet for a moment. The Crow have been in these mountains for generations, he said. I've traded with them, learned from them. The surveys treat the land like it's blank, like nothing was written on it before white men arrived to write things down. His voice held a flat, controlled anger. I don't have any power to change what's coming, but I don't have to pretend it's progress without cost. No, she said. You don't. They sat with that for a moment, the shared discomfort of people who were part of a wave they hadn't chosen and couldn't stop. My father used to say that acknowledging an injustice doesn't fix it, but denying it makes you part of it, she said. He was a wise man, Elias said. He was, she said simply. I miss him every day. He looked at her with a directness that was not pity, but was something warmer and more substantial, a recognition of loss as something real and ongoing, not something to be moved past or managed. How long had he run the shop? He came west from Ohio in 1848, she said. He was 22. He'd apprenticed to a saddler in Columbus, and he wanted to try the frontier, and Harlow's Crossing was barely a creek crossing with a trading post when he got here. He built the shop with his own hands. I watched him work in it before I could walk steadily. She looked around at the walls she knew so well, the organized shelves of tools, the hooks holding works in progress, the smell that lived in the wood itself. This place is him, as much as any grave can be. Elias followed her look around the shop, taking it in the way he took everything in, seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. Then you're not just running a business, he said. No, she said. I'm keeping a promise to a man who can't hear me make it. The silence after that was full of something that was not sadness, but was adjacent to it. The kind of feeling that comes when two people recognize something true about each other. He stayed for 3 days that September visit. There was reason for it. The cinch was only the beginning of his equipment needs, and the resupply took time, and Mrs. Pierce's cooking was, as Clara had told him, excellent. But they both understood that these were convenient facts rather than compelling causes. He helped her with the Langley harness, and then with a batch of saddle work that had come in from the Double Pine Ranch, and then with the simple daily work of maintaining the shop, moving stock, oiling the inventory work, the endless small tasks that accumulated in a leather shop the way a river accumulates silt. They walked to supper together each evening. The first evening at the hotel, the second at the church social that happened to fall on the second day of his visit, the third, because she had mentioned that she often cooked her own supper, and he had said, almost before he'd finished the thought, that he'd eaten enough of his own cooking to last several lifetimes, and he'd be glad to eat anything made by someone else, at the small table in her kitchen. She made beef stew with the dried herbs she grew in the window box and biscuits from a recipe her mother had given her, and coffee from the good beans she kept for occasions that merited them. He sat at her small table and ate 2 full bowls and 4 biscuits, and looked entirely at home in her kitchen in a way that made her feel something large and warm and a little frightening in the center of her chest. After supper they sat on the small porch of her house in the cooling September evening, and the mountains in the distance were turning from purple to black against the last red of the sky. And she could hear the frogs down by the creek and the sound of the dusty spur doing its late evening business 2 streets over. You're going back tomorrow, she said. The weather will hold for another week or 2, he said. Then it turns fast up there. I know. Clara. He'd started using her name on the second day, and she'd said nothing to stop him, and hearing it in his voice was something she was not yet fully accustomed to, a small, reliable surprise each time. I want to say something. Then say it, she said. He turned in the porch chair to face her, and in the last evening light, his face was all strong lines and honest expression. I've spent a lot of years choosing distance from things, he said, from people, from situations that could become complicated. It suited me for a long time, and then it suited me less and less, and I told myself that was just how things were. He stopped, organized his words. Coming down this summer, both times, I haven't been this content in a long time, with a person, with a situation. She was very still, her hands quiet in her lap, her eyes on his face. I know I live up a mountain, he said. I know that's not practical. I know I'm not easy company in the ways that regular men are easy company, and I know I'm not. He paused, and she could see him working through the unfamiliar territory of saying something vulnerable. I'm not what a woman looking for a settled, ordinary life would choose. Elias, she said quietly. I'm not finished, he said, with the slight roughness of a man making himself continue something difficult. I want to keep coming down. I want to come down for you as much as for any supply run or repair. And I want to know whether that is a welcome thing or whether I'm reading something wrong. The frogs kept their song. The last color left the sky. Clara looked at this man who had ridden down from the mountains with a broken cinch strap and stayed to watch her work and helped her hold tension on harness traces and eaten her biscuits at her small kitchen table and talked to her about grief and injustice and the quality of leather like it was all one continuous conversation. And she thought, there it is. There is what this has been all along. "You're not reading something wrong," she said. He let out a breath that was almost soundless, but she heard it, and she understood that this admission had cost him something, and that the relief in that breath was real. "I'm not a woman looking for ordinary," she said. "I'm a woman who runs a leather shop in a territory town and has no particular interest in being managed or contained. What I want is someone who can sit in my shop and eat my food and take me seriously." She paused. "You do all three." His hand moved across the space between their chairs and settled over hers on the porch rail, large and warm and careful, and she turned her hand under his so that they were holding properly. Her fingers between his, and the enormity of him at this close distance was no longer abstract, but entirely immediate and somehow the most comfortable thing. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. He left the next morning as he'd said he would, with the weather window closing and the high country waiting. But the goodbye was different from the first time. He held her hand on the porch of the shop in the gray early morning light, and when he finally released it, he kept his thumb against the inside of her wrist for just a moment, and he said he'd be down before the first heavy snow if the weather permitted, and before it if it didn't. She watched him ride up the north road and disappear into the folds of the land, and she felt the size of the distance between them, but it was a different kind of distance from before. Before it had been absence. Now it was interval, and interval was a thing with a beginning and an end. October opened gold and cold. The aspens on the hillside above town turned overnight, the way they always did, from green to a yellow so intense it was almost violent, and the mornings came with frost on the windows and the need to build the fire before doing anything else. Clara's work intensified as the ranchers made their final runs before winter. Last saddle repairs, harness conditioning, the equipment that needed to be put by in proper condition so that spring didn't start with everything degraded and broken. She worked long hours and ate quickly and slept well from the exhaustion of it, and thought of Elias with a steadiness that was becoming its own kind of comfort. He sent a letter in the middle of October. She hadn't known he would write, had not thought to give him paper and pen for the purpose before he left. But he'd apparently found his own resources, because the letter arrived in the weekly mail run folded twice with her name on the outside in that large, clear hand. It was not a romantic letter in any conventional sense. It was a thorough description of the work he was doing to prepare the cabin for winter, the firewood stores, the food cache, the trapping lines he was setting, the condition of the mare. It mentioned the view from the cabin door on the morning after the first hard frost, where the whole valley below was white, and the sky was the kind of blue that only arrived after the first cold. It mentioned that he had eaten beef stew from a tin, and that it had suffered considerably in comparison to a version he'd had in September. She read it 3 times. She wrote back, sitting at her kitchen table in the evening with the fire going and her best pen out, and she wrote about the shop's autumn work and about the aspen trees, and about how the Halverson boy had tried to sell her a saddle that was falling apart by representing it as a saddle in need of minor work, and how she'd pointed out every fault in it in comprehensive technical detail until he'd stood there looking like a man who wished he was somewhere else entirely. She wrote about the letter from the Bozeman tannery confirming delivery of her spring stock order. She wrote about how Mrs. Pierce's cat had somehow gotten into the shop and spent an afternoon under the bench batting at scraps of leather and hadn't done any real damage except to Clara's concentration. She did not write about how she kept his first letter on the table where she ate breakfast. She should have written that. She almost did. He came down in November, 8 days before the first heavy snow fell on the valley, riding fast and light like the weather was behind him, which it nearly was. He came into the shop with cold air and leather smell and snowflakes in his dark hair, and she had one moment of seeing him in the doorway before he was across the room, and she was standing and then somehow in the small, simple, and enormous fact of his arms, which were very large and very warm, and his face pressed against her hair. She held on. Outside, the wind was picking up. The mountains were gray and enormous against the darker gray of the sky. Inside the shop, with the stove going and the smell of leather all around them, and Elias Cade's arms making a kind of shelter she had not known she'd been missing, Clara Whitmore stood very still for a long moment and let herself simply feel the fullness of it. "You made it before the snow," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I said I would," he said, against her hair. She leaned back enough to look at him. His face was cold from the ride, his cheeks reddened, snowflakes melting at the edges of his hair. He was looking at her with the full attention she'd come to know as characteristic of him, and in his eyes was something warm and certain. "I have work to finish," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll help." He did. And over the following 4 days before the snow arrived in force and made travel to the high country genuinely unwise, he helped with the remaining winter prep work, ate her cooking at the small kitchen table, and she ate Mrs. Dawes's cooking at the hotel, and they walked through the cold gray streets of Harlow's Crossing in the evenings, with his hand at the small of her back, which was a degree of public statement that she was entirely comfortable with. Sheriff Holt stopped them outside the general store on the third day, and looked at them with the measured assessment of a man whose professional occupation was reading situations accurately. "Mr. Cade," he said, "coming to us from the mountain for more than a resupply, I take it." "For Miss Whitmore's work specifically," Elias said very pleasantly. Holt looked at Clara. "Well," he said, "good," and walked on. Mrs. Halverson, encountering them leaving the hotel breakfast on the fourth morning, simply said, "It's about time," to no one in particular, and sailed past without stopping, which was so perfectly in character that Clara laughed out loud on the cold street, and Elias looked at her laughing and smiled his full smile, and the morning was entirely good. He left on the fifth day with the clouds pressing down and the smell of serious snow in the air. And this goodbye had a different quality from all the previous ones, because this time they were not uncertain about what they were to each other. He held her face in his cold hands on the shop porch and looked at her for a long moment before he kissed her, careful and warm, with all the seriousness that was so entirely him, and she put her hands flat against his chest and felt the solid reality of him under her palms and kissed him back. "I'll be down when the spring thaw opens the pass," he said. "I'll be here," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the best thing I know." Winter closed over the valley. Clara worked through December and January in the patient way that she'd learned from her father, the way that the land itself seemed to teach if you lived close enough to it, that winter was not an absence but a different kind of presence, and there was work suited to it that had its own satisfaction. She did the fine detail work that got crowded out in the busy seasons, the restoration work on old equipment, the intricate braiding projects that required uninterrupted concentration, the careful conditioning and repair of the stored equipment that filled her back room. Letters came monthly, sometimes more. Elias's letters were full of the particulars of mountain winter life, the cold figures that he recorded with what she could only describe as respectful objectivity, the supply situation, the trapping results, the wildlife that came to the edges of his clearing in the deep winter months. In February, he wrote at some length about a mountain lion that had been investigating the area around the cabin, the tracks in the snow, the one sighting at dusk that he described with a naturalist's precision, and she found she could see it perfectly. The cat at the edge of the tree line, the fading light, the man in the doorway watching. She wrote about the winter town, which had its own rhythms, the long evenings at Mrs. Dawes's, where the ladies gathered for quilting that was part textile work and part social occasion, the way the cold made everyone more straightforwardly dependent on each other, wood shared between neighbors, meals taken together when the weather was too severe to be alone with it. She wrote about a long conversation with Mrs. Halverson's sister, who'd come from St. Louis for the winter, and who had views about women's property rights that were decades ahead of the territory legislature, and entirely in line with Clara's own. She wrote about the letters from the Bozeman tannery arriving with spring samples, and her excitement about the leather quality and her plans for the new stock. She did not write about how the house felt in the deep January evenings, large and quiet, in a way it hadn't felt quite the same way before. She wrote that, too, eventually, in a letter she kept for a week before sending, and his response, which arrived in mid-March as the first tentative softening of the air began, said that he understood that feeling better than she might know, having spent years in a cabin that had all the right dimensions and all the wrong kind of silence, and that he intended to address it at the first opportunity the spring pass would give him. She reread that letter 4 times at the kitchen table. The spring thaw came in late March, tentative and then sudden, the way it always did in Montana, a few warm days giving way to rain that cleared the snow from the valley floor and left the road soft and smelling of earth. Clara's spring workload arrived with it, the equipment that had wintered in her back room going back to its owners, new orders from the ranchers who'd been planning through the dark months, the Double Pine outfit coming in for a complete overhaul of their working saddles. She was in the middle of a saddle skirt repair. Different saddle, different owner, but the position was the same as it had been that July morning, the bench in the morning light, the awl in her hand, when she heard hooves on the north road. She set down her awl, picked it back up. He came around the corner of the livery at a pace that was somewhere between a purposeful walk and something less contained, the dun mare's hooves kicking up the damp spring mud, and when he saw her on the bench, he slowed to a stop and just looked at her for a moment with an expression that she thought would stay with her for the rest of her life. She stood up from the bench. He dismounted and crossed the street with 3 strides of those long legs, and she met him at the edge of the porch, and he put his hands on her face, and she put her hands flat on his chest, and they stood there in the April morning, looking at each other. "You made it," she said. "The pass has been clear for 2 weeks," he said. "I was finishing the winter work." "You finished the winter work." "I finished it in 3 days," he said. "I spent 11 days arguing with myself about timing." She laughed, genuine and full. "You rode down here to tell me you argued with yourself for 11 days?" "I rode down here," he said, very seriously, "to ask you something." The April air was cool and clear, and the mountains were visible from where they stood with their crowns still white, and the town was waking up around them with its ordinary morning sounds. She looked at Elias Cade's face, this man who had ridden in from the wilderness on a lame horse the previous summer, and stayed to watch her work, and then stayed to hold tension on harness traces, and then stayed to eat her cooking and hold her hand on the porch and kiss her on a November morning. And she thought, "I know what he's going to ask, and I know what I'm going to say." "Ask," she said. He kept his hands on her face. "I spent 4 years telling myself the mountain was enough," he said. "The quiet, the work, the particular satisfaction of being self-sufficient. And it was enough, in the way that adequate is enough when you don't know what more than adequate feels like." He paused, collecting the words with the care he gave to everything. "You are more than adequate, Clara. You are. The whole winter, every time I sat down in that cabin, I was already thinking about coming back to you. Every letter, every morning, every time I watched the weather because it was the thing standing between me and this road." His thumbs moved against her cheekbones. "I want to come down from the mountain permanently. I want to be here, in this town, near you. I want to build something with you if you'll have me. All of it. Whatever that looks like, the shop and the house and the life, I want to be part of it, if you want that too." The frogs down at the creek were singing. A wagon rolled past on the main street. Mrs. Halverson's cat crossed the road without looking at anyone, as cats do. "I want that too," Clara said. He kissed her there on the porch of the shop in front of the entire morning town, one hand still at her face and the other arm coming around her back, lifting her slightly in the way that men of his particular physical abundance could do without thinking about it. And she let him, and she kissed him back, and there was a distant sound that might have been Tom Henley doing something celebratory in the direction of the livery. Elias Cade came down from the mountain. He stayed with Mrs. Pierce for the first 2 months while they arranged the practical details of the life they were building, the legal matters first, which in 1875 Montana were not as simple as they might have been. But Sheriff Holt was a fair man, and Judge Aldrich, when he rode through in May, had the progressive attitude of a man who'd seen too much injustice along gender lines to add to it frivolously. The shop would remain Clara's, titled in her name, as her father had intended it. Elias had his cabin and his furs and the savings from 6 years of disciplined living in the mountains, and he contributed them to the joint venture of their lives without reservation. They were married in June, in the church that doubled as a courthouse when required, with Mrs. Halverson weeping so productively in the front pew that her hat came unpinned, and Tom Henley serving as a witness with the expression of a man who had been proven right about something and was thoroughly enjoying it. Reverend Clark, still wearing the boots she'd repaired for him, conducted the ceremony with the graceful simplicity that the occasion seemed to call for. Elias wore his clean buckskin shirt and had trimmed his hair slightly, though not short. She had told him she liked his hair as it was, and he had looked at her in a way that made that a simpler decision than it might otherwise have been. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd ordered through the general store, a deep blue that she'd chosen because Elias had once mentioned, in a letter, that blue sky over snow was the most beautiful thing the mountains made. After the ceremony, there was food in the churchyard, the community of Harlow's Crossing, turning out in the way small communities do for a wedding, bringing covered dishes and good whiskey, and the particular warmth of people who've been watching two of their own find each other and are collectively pleased about it. Old Mrs. Pierce, accepting Elias's thanks for her months of accommodating him, patted his arm with the confidence of a woman who had observed a great deal in her years. "I knew from the first night you asked for a room," she said. "You sat at my table and ate your supper without saying much, but every time someone mentioned her name you sat up straighter. A body notices these things." Elias looked at Clara across the churchyard, and she met his look, and they shared the small private smile of people who know they've been entirely transparent to everyone around them and don't particularly mind. Elias built a room onto the back of the small house Clara occupied behind the shop, because the house was a good house in a good location, and it made no sense to build from scratch when building on was the sensible choice. He did it himself, through the summer, with the methodical efficiency of a man who had built his own mountain cabin from the ground up and found ordinary carpentry comparatively straightforward. He asked her about every decision, the height of the ceiling, the placement of the windows, whether she wanted a separate pantry, and she told him, and he built it exactly as she said, and the result was a room that was large and light and entirely suited to the life they'd decided to make in it. He also built a new workbench in the shop. The old one was serviceable, but the height was wrong for her. It had been built for her father, who was several inches taller, and she'd been compensating for it her entire career without ever quite registering the toll it took on her back and shoulders. Elias watched her work for 2 days without saying anything, and then one morning he came in and said, "Your bench is too high." She stopped what she was doing and looked at the bench and then at him. "I've worked at this bench since I was 20, she said. "At the wrong height for 20 years, he said. "Let me build you a new one." She considered arguing, because the old bench was her father's, and that meant something. But she also recognized that her father, the practical man he'd been, would have told her the same thing without sentimentality. And she said yes. Elias asked her to stand at the height where her shoulders were level and her elbows comfortable, and he built the bench to that exact measurement, and the first morning she worked at the new bench she had to stop mid-morning because the absence of the familiar strain was so pronounced it nearly moved her to tears. "Better?" Elias said from his stool. "Don't say I told you so," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said with perfect sincerity. He was a good partner in the practical ways, but also in the ways that were harder to quantify. He understood that the shop was hers, that the work was hers, that her expertise was hers, and he did not position himself as the authority in a space where she was the authority. He helped when help was useful and stepped back when it wasn't, and he seemed to find genuine satisfaction in both roles, which was a quality she had not expected to find and valued enormously. He also made her laugh, not with jokes particularly. He was not a joking man in the conventional sense, but with the dry accuracy of his observations, the way he said precisely the right thing about precisely the wrong moment in a way that collapsed her composure entirely. The day that Aldrich Harper, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and had a correspondingly elevated opinion of himself, came in to pick up his repaired saddle and spent 10 minutes explaining to Clara how the repair should have been done differently, and Elias, who was quietly doing inventory in the back of the shop, said in a perfectly conversational tone, "She charged you $1.50 for that saddle, Mr. Harper. What she charged you for the lesson in how to do her job herself would be considerably more." The expression on Harper's face was something she remembered for years afterward. In the fall of their first married year, Clara found she was expecting. She told Elias on a Sunday morning in October, the same month the previous year, that she'd stood on the porch and heard him tell her about riding down from the mountains. They were at the kitchen table. The kitchen table was where the important conversations happened in their house, she'd noticed. It had some quality of intimacy and practicality combined that suited both of them, and she set down her coffee cup and said, I have something to tell you. He set down his own cup. His full attention arrived, as it always did, immediately and completely. I'm expecting, she said. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which she would later describe to Mrs. Halverson as the longest 4 seconds of her life. Then, Elias Cade's face did something she'd never quite seen it do before. It went entirely open, all the contained, steady composure that was so characteristically him coming apart in a way that was not chaotic, but was simply full, like a landscape at sunrise when the light finally reaches all the angles the dark had kept. He got up from the table, came around to her, drew her up and held her the way he held her, with the full commitment of someone who intended to make holding her a permanent feature of his existence. Are you well? He asked against her hair, which was his first question because it was the first question, the most important one. Completely, she said. Healthy and well, and apparently going to need to modify the workbench setup in approximately 5 months. He made a sound that was a laugh and something more. I'll build you whatever you need, he said. I know you will, she said. That's one of my favorite things about you. The baby was born the following May, on the last Sunday of the month, which was a good Montana spring day, with the mountains clear and the wild roses starting on the hillside, and the sound of the creek running full from snowmelt coming through the open window. Elias was there through all of it, which was not the common arrangement. Most women of that era and that place managed the business of childbirth with women's help only. But Clara had looked at her husband and said simply that she wanted him there, and he had said he wouldn't be anywhere else, and that was the end of that conversation. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas for the brother she'd lost, and Samuel for the father who had built the shop. Thomas Samuel Cade arrived in the world with considerable opinions about the arrangements, which he expressed at length, and which Elias held him through with the focused calm of a man who had managed rowdy pack animals in mountain storms and knew how to be steady for the duration. He has your determination, Clara said, exhausted and entirely happy, watching her husband hold their son with those enormous hands so carefully, the baby's whole body contained in the length of his arms. He has your eyes, Elias said, not looking up from the child, with a quality in his voice that she'd never heard from him and recognized as awe. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Thomas grew as Montana children grew, fast and sturdy and outdoors as much as possible, finding the shop irresistible almost before he could walk steadily, pulling himself up against the workbench with his fat fists and watching his mother with wide eyes. Clara worked with the baby in a carrier strapped to her chest for the first months, finding with some surprise that the rhythm of her work soothed him as thoroughly as anything else. The smell of the leather and the steady motion of her hands seemed to be as good as a lullaby, and she thought of her father and how many hours she'd spent in this same shop in her earliest years and thought, perhaps it's in the grain of the place itself. Elias took on farrier work from Tom Henley, who was glad enough to share the load as his arthritis made the heavier jobs difficult, and he guided 2 more survey expeditions through the mountain passes at rates that, as he told Clara with dry precision, suggested the survey office had some idea of what the passes were actually like, because anyone who'd been there wouldn't set a fee that low. He also began working with the Double Pine Ranch on their horse breeding program, which grew from an early conversation with the ranch foreman into a regular arrangement, and which suited him. The work with the horses was the kind of work that used his particular knowledge and his capacity for patient, careful attention over long periods, and he was good at it in a way that the ranch was glad to have. The shop expanded in the 2nd year of their marriage. Clara had saved through the winter with a specific purpose in mind, and in the spring of 1877, she commissioned a proper storefront addition, a proper window for display, a dedicated customer area separate from the working space, and a sign painted by the young man from the printing office who had a talent for lettering: Whitmore, Leather, and Tack. She kept the name because it was her father's name and the town knew it, and Elias not only understood this but told her it was the right call with the kind of directness that made her love him more. He built the addition himself, with help from a few men from the Double Pine, and Clara watched it go up in a week with a feeling of expansion in her chest that went beyond the physical structure. Her father had built the original shop with his own hands, and now the man she'd chosen was expanding it with his, and there was something in that continuity that felt like grace. Mrs. Halverson came to the opening day and stood in the new customer area and looked at the display saddle Clara had made specifically for the window. A working ranch saddle, beautifully crafted, with silver conchos on the skirt that caught the light, and said, "Your father would have been proud." Clara stood beside her husband in the doorway of the shop that bore her family's name, with their son on her hip, and said, "I know he would." They received a letter in the fall of 1877 from the Kowalski Tannery in Bozeman, which had grown into a substantial business partnership over the past 2 years, asking whether they'd be interested in a formal arrangement to represent their stock in the eastern Montana territory. The letter was addressed to Whitmore Leather and Tack, and the terms were favorable enough that Clara spent an evening at the kitchen table doing the mathematics before telling Elias, who sat across from her with his coffee and Thomas on his knee and waited while she worked through it. "It's a good opportunity," she said at last. "It is," he agreed. "It means more volume than I can handle alone." "It does. I'd need to hire." "Probably," she looked at him. "You have an opinion." "My opinion is that you should do it," he said. "My opinion is also that if you hire someone, they should be trained by you and understand that your standards are your standards and not subject to being negotiated down." "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said. "I know," he said with the slight warmth that accompanied his certainty about her. She hired a girl named Mary Bright the following spring, a practical, quick-learning 20-year-old who'd come to Harlow's Crossing with her family from Nebraska and who had hands that Clara recognized immediately as the hands of someone who would be good with the work. Mary learned in the way that Clara had learned, standing at the bench watching and then trying and then refining, and Clara taught her in the way her father had taught her, thoroughly, respectfully, treating the craft as the serious and skilled thing it was. Thomas, at 2.5, appointed himself Mary's supervisor, which Mary endured with great good humor. Elias watched all of this from his various positions in the orbit of the shop, and one evening he said, "You're a good teacher." "My father was a good teacher," Clara said. "You had a good example," he said. "You've also made something of your own of it. The way you break down the work, the way you explain it without talking down to her, that's yours. That's not just inherited." She set down what she was doing and looked at him across the kitchen table. Thomas was asleep. The fire was low but warm. The shop was closed and quiet next door, holding its inventory and its smells and the accumulated presence of 30 years of one family's work. "Do you know what I remember most about the day you rode in?" she said. He waited. "You said I'd want to reinforce the panel before I stitched," she said. "And I told you I'd already cut the backing panel and it was soaking in the bucket. And you looked at the bucket and then you looked at me and I thought, this man is paying actual attention. Not performing attention, not trying to be impressive, just seeing what was there." He was quiet for a moment. "You were already 3 steps ahead of where I thought you'd be," he said. "I saw that immediately. I felt a bit foolish. You didn't seem foolish." "I recovered," he said with the dry quality that always got her. "You stayed to watch," she said. "I stayed to watch," he agreed. "And then I couldn't think of a good reason to stop." She reached across the kitchen table and took his hand. Those large, scarred, careful hands that had held her son and held harness tension and built her workbench at exactly the right height and held her face on a November morning when the snow was coming. "Nor could I," she said. "Think of a good reason to stop, that is." "Then we're well matched on that count," he said. "Among others," she said. A second child arrived in 1879. A daughter this time, born in autumn with the aspens turning gold on the hillside, with a quantity of dark hair that Elias spent a considerable amount of time looking at, with an expression of somewhat bewildered delight. They named her Ruth Eleanor. Ruth for Elias's mother, who had died before he'd left Virginia. Eleanor for the best quality Clara associated with her own mother, which was the capacity to hold her position under pressure and make it look effortless. Ruth was born with an opinion about everything, expressed in decibels that struck everyone as impressive for a person of her size, and Thomas, 3 years old and deeply interested in his new sister, spent a week informing anyone who would listen that the baby was loud. Elias handled both of them with the steady patience that was, Clara had concluded, simply part of his constitution, not acquired, not performed, but native to him in the way that the capacity to navigate rough terrain was native to a mountain horse. The shop in those years was a place of genuine life. Mary Bright had become a skilled craftswoman in her own right, and Clara had given her the lead work on several major saddle orders, trusting her judgment the way her father had trusted hers. The storefront had become something of a social location in the way that the best small-town businesses do, a place where people gathered to pick up or drop off work and stayed to talk, where news moved through in the way news did in the territory, person to person, shaped and reshaped in the telling, but carrying its kernel of truth through. Elias was present in the shop most mornings, working on the various repairs and equipment needs that came in from the Double Pine and the other ranches he worked with, and the combination of his strength for the heavy work and Clara's precision for the fine work had become efficient in the way that two people who know each other's capabilities can be efficient, anticipating, supplementing, each filling the gaps of the other without needing to negotiate it. There was one winter evening when Thomas, 6 years old now, and possessed of an intense curiosity about everything, asked his father how he'd come to live in the mountains alone, and Elias told him, honestly, in terms suited to the boy, about the war and the need to find quiet after it, about learning the mountains the way you learned any difficult thing, by paying attention and making mistakes, and paying more attention. Thomas listened with the wide-eyed focus of a child receiving information he knew was important. "Were you lonely?" Thomas asked. Elias looked at Clara across the table. She looked back. "Sometimes," Elias said. "Yes, but then I found something better." "What?" Thomas asked. "Your mother," Elias said simply. Thomas processed this with the serious consideration of a 6-year-old. "Because she has the leather shop?" Clara made a sound she converted quickly and with effort into a cough. "Because of a great many things," Elias said. "The shop is one of them." Ruth, who was 2 and had been applying herself to a biscuit throughout this conversation, looked up at the mention of the shop and said, "Shop," with great satisfaction, and returned to the biscuit. It was not clear whether she was expressing agreement or simply executing a vocabulary exercise. The years of the late 1870s and into the 1880s brought changes to the territory that were felt even in Harlow's Crossing, the railroad lines extending into Montana, bringing in settlers at a rate that changed the landscape of the communities, the land pressures that Elias had anticipated and grieved over long before they fully materialized, the slow loss of the uncrowded spaces that had defined the frontier. He did not go back to the mountain. The cabin remained his. He rode up every summer for a week, maintaining it, checking the trapping lines, sitting in the doorway in the evening and looking at the view he'd once thought was sufficient company. But the life that had seemed the only right one for him before had been thoroughly superseded by the life he'd chosen instead. He told Clara this on a summer evening when Thomas was 7 and Ruth was 3. Sitting on the porch they'd expanded to wrap around the back of the house, watching the mountains go through their evening ritual of color change. Thomas was playing in the yard with the boundless energy of a boy who had been outdoors all day and had no intention of running out of it. And Ruth was sitting on Elias's knee examining a piece of scrap leather from the shop with the focused attention she brought to everything. "The cabin used to be the whole of it," Elias said. "Everything I needed. I used to stand in the doorway and watch the valley below and think, everything I want is up here. Everything that isn't up here is complication." Clara was watching Thomas chase something imaginary across the yard. "What changed?" "You," he said, without drama or performance, just the plain fact. And then him, and then her. He glanced down at Ruth, who had found a particularly interesting edge on the scrap leather and was exploring it with her finger. "It turns out the valley below was where everything I actually wanted was, the whole time. I just hadn't come down far enough to see it yet." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, the big, warm, solid certainty of it. "That saddle needed work," she said. "It did," he agreed. "And you rode in on your lame horse and stood there and told me I'd want to reinforce the panel." "And you had already cut the backing panel," he said, with the same warmth that the memory always carried, the clarity of a moment that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. 3 steps ahead. "And you stayed to watch," she said. "And I stayed," he said. Thomas came to a stop in the yard, turned, and looked at his parents on the porch with the sudden attentive curiosity of a child who has registered that something important is being said. He was, Clara thought, very much his father's son in that quality, that capacity for real attention, for seeing what was actually there. "Are you talking about the shop again?" Thomas demanded. "Always," Elias said gravely. Thomas made the noise of a 7-year-old who has assessed a situation and found it beneath his current energy level and returned to whatever he was chasing across the yard. Ruth looked up at her father and said, "Shop," again, with the serene certainty of a child who knows the important words. "Shop," Elias agreed. Clara laughed, and he pressed his lips to the top of her hair, and the mountains held their evening colors a little longer than usual, the way they sometimes did when the air was still and the light was right, and the world had that quality it occasionally achieved of being precisely as it should be, not perfect in any abstract sense, but right, specific, real, the sum of 100 small decisions. And one morning in July 1874, when a man had ridden in from the North Road and stopped at a woman's workbench and said she'd want to reinforce the panel. She'd known it already. She'd already cut the backing panel and put it in the water. But he had stayed. He had stayed to watch, and then stayed to help, and then stayed for everything. That, Clara Whitmore Cade would have told you, was the most important part. Staying. In 1882, the Whitmore shop took on its first female apprentice, who wasn't Clara herself. Her name was June Atwater, 17 going on 18, daughter of a homesteading family that had come from Kansas, and she appeared at the door one April morning with the particular combination of hope and prepared for disappointment that Clara recognized as the look of a girl who'd been told no for wanting something. Clara had hired her on the spot, looked her over, asked her 2 questions about what she'd done with her hands so far in her life, and said, "Be here Monday at 7. Elias, hearing this account over supper, said, "Your father would have done the same thing." "My father did do the same thing," Clara said, "with me." "Then it runs in the family," he said. "It will," she said. Thomas, 9 now, and increasingly interested in everything that happened in the shop, had strong opinions about whether he would eventually work there himself. His current position was that he would work with horses like his father, which shifted regularly to leather work when he spent time in the shop, and back again when Elias took him out to the Double Pine. Clara and Elias had agreed without discussing it that they would wait to see where his interest actually settled before any opinion either of them held became a plan. Ruth, at 5, had no ambiguity on the subject. She would work in the shop. This had been announced with the complete certainty of someone who had never once doubted it, and she demonstrated her intention regularly by climbing onto Clara's stool when her mother's back was turned and applying herself to whatever scrap material she could reach with whatever implement was available. She had already produced, under careful supervision, a small piece of leather braiding that Mary Bright had pronounced genuinely competent. Mary Bright herself had married the blacksmith's assistant the previous year, a good, quiet young man named Carl, who was completely unintimidated by the fact that his wife was skilled in a trade and inclined to have opinions about things, which was, in Mary's view and Clara's view, the most essential qualification, and was now Mary Brennan, still working at the shop 3 days a week and managing the rest of her time with the efficiency that Clara had long since recognized as one of her best qualities. In 1883, a man came into the shop with a proposition. He was from the Rocky Mountain Leather Company in Denver, a well-dressed, confident man named Garrett, who explained at some length that his company was looking to acquire small regional leather operations and bring them under a unified brand. He had numbers that were meant to be impressive, and he presented them in the manner of someone who expected them to do the persuading for him. Clara listened to all of it with the full attention she gave to everything, and then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. This shop was built by my father and has been operated under my name and his for 40 years. It is not for sale." Garrett, who had clearly not expected a flat refusal from a woman he'd imagined would be grateful for the offer, tried several approaches and got the same answer each time with decreasing degrees of pleasantness on Clara's part. By the 3rd attempt, she was no longer being pleasant about it at all. The moment when Elias, who had been in the back room during this entire exchange, appeared in the doorway. All of him, the full 6 feet of mountain-built capability, with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who was not threatening anything, but who was entirely clear about the parameters of a situation, was the moment Garrett decided he had other calls to make. After he'd left, Clara looked at her husband. "I had it in hand." "I know you did," Elias said. "I just thought I'd be visible." "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. They looked at each other with the ease of people who understand each other completely and had arrived at that understanding through years of paying attention. And then Clara returned to the saddle she'd been working on, and Elias returned to the back room, and that was the end of Mr. Garrett. The shop turned 40 years old in 1888, if you counted from the year her father had arrived and begun building. Clara counted from that year. She marked it with a small celebration in the new customer area. Coffee and pie from Mrs. Dawes, the community coming through in ones and twos. Sheriff Holt stopping in to say he'd brought his equipment here for 20 years and intended to bring it for 20 more. Old Reverend Clark, still wearing the boots she'd resoled, a point of pride on her part, saying that this shop had been the most reliable institution in Harlow's Crossing for the entirety of his ministry. Thomas, 15 now, and increasingly his father's height if not yet his width, stood in the doorway of the shop that afternoon and looked at it with the expression of someone taking inventory of something they love, and Clara stood beside him and did the same. "Grandfather built the original," Thomas said. 17 days, Clara said. "I've read the diary entries. He was not a man who wasted words, but he counted every nail." "And you built the rest of it," Thomas said. "And Pa built the extension." "And you helped build the storage addition when you were 12, she said. "You carried boards for 3 days without complaint." "I complained," Thomas said. "You just didn't hear me." She put her arm through his. "No complaints on record," she said. "Officially." He leaned his head briefly against hers, the tall, awkward lean of a teenage boy who loves his mother and has not quite calibrated how to show it gracefully. "I think I do want to work with the horses," he said. "Like Pa, if that's all right." "That's exactly all right," she said. "But maybe also some leather work on the side," he said. "The horse equipment, saddles, harness." "Which would make you a horseman who makes his own equipment," she said, "which is what your grandfather was when he started." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Is it strange," he said, "that I want to do the same things?" "It's exactly right," she said. Ruth, 14 and approximately 4 months away from the age at which Clara intended to begin her formal apprenticeship at the bench, was already functioning as an unofficial apprentice. June Atwater, who was now June Peters, and the senior craftsperson of the shop after Clara, had been giving her systematic instruction for a year. Ruth had her mother's hands and her father's capacity for sustained, patient focus, and she had her grandfather's love of the work itself, which was the thing that couldn't be taught and had to be found, and she'd found it young. Clara watched her work sometimes with a full, quiet feeling that defied easy description, something between pride and recognition, the sense of a line continuing that had begun before her and would extend past her. Elias, in his late 40s now, had the particular quality of a man who had spent his youth in extremes and arrived at his middle years in something more sustaining. He was still physically formidable in the way that men who do real work remain formidable, not diminished by the years, but settled further into his own strength, the way a mountain settles over geological time. His dark hair had silver at the temples, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened, and his face had the quality of good leather that has been well cared for. More character, not less structure. He and Clara walked on Sunday evenings as they had done for years, out past the edge of town to where the trail climbed toward the first ridge, not going far, just far enough to be in the open air with the view they both loved, the valley below and the mountains above, and the particular Montana sky that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. On one such evening in the autumn of 1888, walking in the long September light, Elias said, "You remember the morning I rode in?" "Frequently," she said. "I had planned to stay an hour," he said, "get the horse seen to, resupply, be back on the road. And instead, you stood against my wall for an afternoon. You were very skilled," he said, with the gravity he used for things he meant completely. "You were very obvious," she said. "I thought I was being subtle." "You were not," she said. He made the sound that was his laugh, warm and low, and she thought about how many times she'd heard it, and how it was still the same pleasant slight shock of warmth, the way a good fire is, familiar but reliably warming. "I've never regretted staying," he said. "Nor have I," she said. "Not for a moment, not once." They stood at the top of the first ridge and looked at the town below, at the cluster of buildings that made up Harlow's Crossing, at the thin gray line of the north road that led up and away toward the mountains in the high country. The shop's new sign caught the last of the light and threw it back briefly. Whitmore, leather and tack, her father's name, her own life, her children's inheritance. Elias put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, this man who had ridden in from the wilderness on a lame horse one July morning and found something in a leather shop that the mountains, for all their grandeur, had never quite given him. They stood like that for a while, looking at everything they'd made. Below them, in the shop that smelled of leather and wax in the accumulated years of two families' work, Ruth Cade was at the bench with June Peters, and the lamp was burning, and the careful, precise motions of craft were continuing in the hands of the next generation, as they had continued in Clara's hands from her father's, as they would continue forward into whatever Montana became as the century turned and the territories settled into statehood and the wild country was mapped and fenced and civilized. But that was yet to come. Tonight there was the ridge and the view, and the man beside her, and the town below where their children were learning the things they would carry, and the mountains behind them where a younger and lonelier version of Elias Cade had once stood in a cabin doorway looking down at the valley and not yet knowing what was in it. She'd been in it. She'd been there all along, at the bench with the awl in her hand, reinforcing the panel before she'd been asked, 3 steps ahead, the way she always was. He just had to ride in and see it, and stay.